Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. I'm Christina, and today's episode is Who Killed Chicken Farming in America? Concentration and Price Fixing in the Poultry Industry. Quote-unquote big agriculture has been subject to immense criticism and scrutiny in recent years, and increasingly so under the Biden administration. In this episode of Our Curious Amalgam, we'll hear from three individuals and their distinct and important perspective on the topic. Joining me today is my co-host Anant Raut. Hey Anant, what are we doing today?
We're talking about chickens, Christina. 8 billion of them. That's the number of chickens consumed annually in the U.S. In 1970, Americans ate around 50 pounds of chicken per person every year. Today, it's almost double that. In the last few years, we've seen bonuses for poultry executives go up, retail prices of chickens go up, and farmer compensation go down. Why is this happening, and what does this all mean for farmers and consumers? A relatively small number of companies stand between the thousands of poultry farmers in the U.S. and the billions of pounds of chicken that find its way into your local grocery store. 4 companies, Tyson's, Pilgrim's Pride, Perdue, and Sanderson, control 54% of the poultry processing market. Almost all of their broiler chickens are supplied by independent farmers under contract. Following World War II, in response to increased demand for chicken, poultry companies introduced the contracting model, in which they sold the chicks and feed to the farmer and bought them back at market price. It was supposed to help farmers by decreasing their financial risk. And if farmers didn't like the terms, they could switch to a competing processor at the end of their contract. In 1950, 90% of chickens were sold on the open market. By the end of that decade, 90% were being sold under contract. But consolidation was also increasing in the agricultural sector. The Supreme Court's 1986 decision in Cargill versus Montfort, which denied a competitor's antitrust challenge of the merger of the number 2 and 3 beef packers in the U.S., opened a wave of consolidation, which meant that in practice, many livestock farmers ended up with only a single buyer for the region. It's enough to make you say, what the cluck? Our first guest today is Craig Watts, formerly a contract farmer for 22 years with Perdue. Welcome, Craig.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into chicken farming.
I grew up on this multi-generational family farm. We farmed grain, and at that time the money was in tobacco. There's a lot of us that grew up on small tobacco farms, and you could do that then. And then tobacco kind of got the tobacco was kind of fading away, and we were going to get big and be big grain farmers. And then my dad had a heart attack. So we decided to get out and started renting the land, but I never left agriculture. I worked with a company that did research with agriculture chemicals, where we did environmental fate studies where the pesticides would be re-registered or registered from the EPA. So I got a chance to see the world from the inside of an airport, and that was no fun. So we got a chance to come back to North Carolina and do a lot of work. And so I got a chance to do it on our farm. And that's kind of when I got the bug. I wanted to come back to the farm full time. And 20 years prior to that, I never would have thought that. But I was getting married, and I was tired of traveling. And that exact moment that's when the chicken companies came in and were courting farmers to sign up to raise chickens. I think the advertisement in the newspaper said we need a few smart birds to raise our birds. So I have a business degree, agriculture background. I'm not a suit and tie kind of guy. It just seemed like a perfect fit. They came out, made a presentation, sounded good, not get rich quick. I carried it to an accountant and had him run the numbers, but it was enough to get by with. So that's how I kind of got into the chicken business. It was just my desire to get back to the farm.
Explain the terms under which you were contracting to raise chickens.
Oh, my goodness. Contract's kind of a funny word. I don't know. To me, it means mutual obligation. But there's not much mutual obligation in a chicken contract. It's kind of a take it or leave it, one-sided deal. The conditions is you agree to do everything they tell you to do. I mean, it's just that simple.
And this, from our earlier conversation, something jumped out at me. Did you receive a physical copy of your contract?
what they presented when they came out to hook me into the business was actually a pro forma. It wasn't even a contract. It was just like an income and expense projection. I don't know exactly when I saw the contract, but I know this. When I took the numbers to the accountant, it was a big bird program. They called it a roaster, like an 8 or 9 pound chicken. Well, by the time we got to supplying the plant over in Dillon, that was going to be a small bird. So all the numbers that I had crunched were really basically for nothing. And I signed the contract like right before I got the first batch of chickens. I mean, might as well just say they throw it on the hood of the truck. I signed it. I didn't even question it because I was $200 and some thousand in debt. And, and at that time, was very optimistic.
Craig, the contract called for you to be in what's known as a tournament system. Can you explain what that means to our listeners?
Well, the tournament system is this unique thing that the poultry companies have come up with in the way they compensate their farmers. Basically, I keep it real simple, not digging the weeds. Basically, it's who can get the chicken the fattest on the least amount of feed. Basically, there's a feed cost. You divide that by the number of pounds. That gives you a cost per pound of feed. Whoever has the lowest cost is the best farmer for that week, and whoever has the highest cost is the worst farmer for that week. But usually there's about at least 10 farmers that settle together. It's kind of like Thunderdome. It's like 10 men enter, 5 men leave. Because what happens is you take that cost per pound of feed from those 10 growers, you add it up, divide it by 10, you strike an average. Roughly half of those farmers are going to be better than average, meaning they're going to get a little bonus. Then 5 of those farmers are going to be a little worse than average, meaning the way they pay the bonus is they actually deduct the pay from the bottom 5 farmers to pay the top farmers. So base pay in a chicken contract is the only place in the world I know of where base means average. To me, base always meant bottom, but not in a chicken contract. So you can't really even go off base pay because you just never know. And and it sounds great. Okay, we the most efficient farmer, the hardest working farmer, he should get rewarded the most, and he should. But the problem is there's 5 words. It's all inputs are not equal, meaning this tournament system is supposed to be a direct reflection of that farmer's management. Well, it's not quite that simple because the company owns the birds, the company owns the feed. You're totally at their mercy, and you cannot hatch 2 million chicks a week out that are genetically identical or have the same genetic potential. You just can't do it. It's impossible. The website from the National, or whatever they are, Chicken Council says that all farmers start with the same quality chicks and feed. Not possible. It's just logistically impossible. And if you get in competition is if you and I are racing on a 50-yard dash, we start at 0 and run to 50. Well, if I get back bad chicks, I've backed up 10 yards and I have to run 60 to your 50. Chances are you're going to beat me.
So you had no control of the inputs really into the system that you were obliged to participate in.
No, we're totally at the mercy of the integrators on the far as chicks and feed and vaccine programs. There's just so much that can happen between the time an egg is laid and the time that chick is delivered to the farm that's out of the farmer's control that will directly affect his compensation.
And this is different from the kind of open market that I think was contemplated when the contracting system first came about over half century ago, because you're not guaranteeing a price per pound for everybody. You're actually pitting farmers against each other. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, like I said, it's supposed to be a method where the farmers work to be as efficient as they can, but it winds up being I don't know. It divides up being kind of a divide and conquer kind of system where the farmers we don't really communicate much.
If you didn't like the terms, why didn't you just switch to a different company?
Well, that's the thing about the chicken business, or in my area anyway. What happened was there was not poultry really in this area, so Purdue was actually the first company to come in, and so if I didn't like it, there was nobody else to grow for. And there's allegedly, even if there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 integrators in that area, there's allegedly, and there's a lawsuit about it now, there's no poaching agreement where the companies won't, take the other farmers from the other companies. So you basically got one option to sell to.
Okay. And then ultimately, what made you leave chicken farming?
That what made me leave chicken farming was there was a lot of little things. It's like 2 years into it, I had like my first moment. I went from 2 houses to 4 houses because at that point in time, I was in the honeymoon phase and everything was going okay. And then I got that first check and the income didn't double. My expenses more than doubled. And I knew right then I was in trouble, but I wasn't just $200,000 in debt then. I was $400,000 in debt then. And just little things along the way, I found out how little control we actually have of our own farm. Basically, when that white truck put up on my farm, I might have just handed them the keys and left. And then there was one instance where they used to be bad for forcing us to upgrade equipment, meaning the houses were built to the integrator specs, but every so often there was this new thing that you had to have, or the whole chicken industry was going to implode, and you don't have to do it, but if you don't do it, we won't give you any more birds. That was what I got, and so that didn't sit well. And then I saw this commercial. I was sitting in a motel room in Brookings, South Dakota, and it was a Purdue commercial, and the chairman was walking in the chicken house, and it was like pristine. There was fresh pine shavings. The birds were beautiful and white. It looked like they had a half an acre apiece to roam around in. Looked like you'd wipe the feed pans down with Armor All. And I'm thinking, this is not what I see every day. So that was in 2012, and I kind of had to sit on that a little while. But then we did a video and we exposed the actual conditions. And then so the relationship with the company at that point just went south in a hurry, and that there was no reason to stay in it.
Well, thank you, Craig. Our next guest is Claire Kelloway, a senior researcher and reporter with the Open Markets Institute, a leading-edge progressive think tank. She's also the lead writer for the Food and Power newsletter. Welcome, Claire.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Does the chicken industry have a concentration problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said at the top of the show, the top 4 companies control more than half of the industry. And as Craig just talked about, for farmers, practically concentration is much more acute because farmers only have so many companies that they can work with in a given region. So it's estimated, or USDA data shows that half of chicken farmers report having just 1 or 2 integrators to work with. And that doesn't even account for regions where farmers might technically have multiple integrators to work with, but companies might have informal no poach agreements, as Craig talked about, these backroom deals not to poach other farmers.
Because with livestock, unlike some other kinds of goods, you can't shop around for a better deal across the country. You really are limited to your local buyer. Is that right?
Yeah, an animal's a living creature. You can only ship it so far. You can't be growing chickens in Georgia and sending them to be processed in Colorado. You can't move a chicken that far.
Is this concentration problem, is it just in chickens, or do you see that elsewhere in other agricultural industries?
The concentration is definitely a trend across the whole food system, from seeds to processing to grocery stores. Even looking just at meat, pork is even more concentrated than chicken, with the top 4 companies controlling about 2/3 of the industry. Beef is even more concentrated than that. The top 4 companies control 85% of the industry. And this trend of increased mergers and increased concentration, again, is really consistent across all parts of the food supply chain.
And this is one of the core criticisms of the current approach to antitrust, isn't it? This allowing industries to consolidate down to a small number of players under some theory that consumers will be better off and you're going to realize all these efficiencies. But at some point, when you don't have enough competitors, they're not fighting with each other to lure farmers with better terms. They're matching each other in how to impose more onerous terms, how to offload more risk onto farmers. I mean, is that what you're saying?
Definitely, these companies have reached a certain point of consolidation where they're competing on market power. Past a certain point, they're competing on buying up more of their competitors, on having more bargaining power with big grocery stores and big buyers, on having more power over farmers to, extract poorer and poorer terms. So absolutely, I think this shows how companies talk a lot about efficiency, but absolutely market power and exerting that in many different ways to the detriment of farmers is definitely another way they're competing.
Because the argument is that consumers are going to be better off. You can have lower prices for consumers by squeezing the suppliers. But what we've been seeing is prices for consumers have been going up. Since December 2020, prices for beef have gone up 14%, pork have gone up 12%, poultry 6.5%. Yet the dollar share of the farmers is actually going down. So you have prices going up, suppliers losing how much money they're getting out of it, and where the profit's going, you're seeing record profits for the biggest processors in the first half of this year in some of these markets.
That's right. I think there's been a few trends going on, even predating some of the price spikes that we're seeing now. Up until this point, there's been evidence in cases and even indictments and guilty pleas of these companies conspiring with one another to fix prices. That is a little different than the type of inflation that we're seeing now, which I think is what you're talking about with the recent price spikes and the historic profit margins. The profit margins, tell you everything. Well, not everything, but a big chunk of what you need to know about the market power issue here, in the sense that meat companies are saying they're passing along increased costs to consumers. And there are genuine increased costs. There are labor shortages, in part ones that they've created by exposing their workers to risk and unsafe conditions. And there are genuine supply chain disruptions, but basic economics, you wouldn't expect them to be making more money. You would expect them to be raising prices, up until the point that it reflects their increased cost, but that's not happening. They're also bringing in record profits. And that demonstrates that they have some market power to work in concert, because another, basic economic concept you would expect is if any company is getting undue profits, then someone else will come in, lower their prices to steal their profits away and compete with them. But if there's so few companies in the market and they don't feel pressure to compete, they can all kind of act as one and ride the wave together and all benefit from higher profits. And that definitely is what seems to be going on.
And it also can lead to another type of overtly illegal activity, which Brent is going to get into. But when you have fewer competitors in the market, it makes it easier to engage in price fixing.
Right. And as Brett's going to get into that, and I guess that's what I was trying to get at earlier, there's already been, tried and indicted cases of price fixing in the years leading up to the trend we're seeing now. Which again is slightly different, but both forms of either tacit or explicit collusion to raise prices.
And the effect on farmers, what struck me in the January 3rd statement from the White House announcing their new investment in processing capacity is that 50 years ago, ranchers got 60 cents out of every dollar spent on beef, and now it's 39 cents. And hog farmers got 40 to 60 cents spent on pork, and now it's down to 19 cents. So the effect on farmers of this consolidation has been, they're hurting.
Yeah, pork is it's a horrible example. It's a sad example of with the rise of more consolidated and vertically integrated contracting of pork production. We see 80% of hog farmers going out of business starting in the late 80s to today. And that's been almost entirely a trend of shifting towards these larger farms that can fulfill contracts of a small handful of producers and survive on lower prices by having sort of a low cost, high volume business, as opposed to a network of smaller independent farmers that aren't selling on forward contracts. So yeah, definitely there have been areas of the food economy where prices that ranchers and livestock farmers are receiving have been suppressed with increased concentration.
Claire, the Biden administration announced on January 3rd that it was going to invest in new independent processing capacity in the meat processing industry. It seems like that might get to the heart of the concentration problem. What do you think?
I think it'll help, certainly. I think there's a few things that need to happen. Definitely, the industry has become sufficiently consolidated that there is the case for making this new investment to help new plants get started. With the aftermath of the pandemic, it became really clear that there is not sufficient diversity of processing, either a diversity of scale or region or even different kinds of business forms. So thinking about like cooperatively owned meat packing, most of what we have is investor owned. Point being, though, there does really need to be this injection of funds to increase that diversity. So when things go wrong, and if you want to have resiliency, you have plants operating at different scales in different regions. There are still obviously going to be large plants, but also having more medium-sized plants like there were more of around the 60s and 70s, and also having some hyper-local plants and plants, again, that are operating under different priorities, that maybe aren't as focused on just short-term benefits to investors. But I think we also need to be looking at the competition laws more broadly and the terms under which these packers are operating. Because if you still have an industry that's quite favorable to mergers, if you have permissive, for instance, like exclusive dealing arrangements with grocery stores and different types of conduct that limit access to market, these plants, still could face the same issues of small and medium-sized plants before in getting access to markets and competing. So I think the investment is really historic and important, but this is also a time to be looking at competition rules more broadly and how can we change and balance the playing field so these firms have their best chance at succeeding and competing actually on things like efficiency and fairness and better service, competing on the things we want them to compete on that are good for society, and not some of the harmful things like we've been talking about, like squeezing their workers and squeezing farmers.
Yeah, and competing for the farmers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, competing by giving them better terms of service.
I'd like to turn now to Brent Snyder, partner at Wilson Sonsini and a longtime criminal antitrust prosecutor. Brent was previously Deputy Assistant Attorney General, overseeing all of the DOJ Antitrust Division's criminal division, as well as formerly the head of the Hong Kong Competition Commission. Brent, it seems as though we're talking about a couple of different things at work here in the poultry industry. There is concentration, which can happen under the ambit of the law, but there's also illegal activity that may be occurring. Can you tell us a little bit about what we publicly know that the DOJ is investigating right now?
Sure. Let me start out by saying that the USDOJ Antitrust Division and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission have always and will always be interested in transactions and competitor conduct affecting competition involving consumer staples and agricultural products. Basic foodstuffs for American households certainly fall into that basket. And that's especially true if there's evidence that competing suppliers, competing providers of agricultural products, foodstuffs, have reached agreements between themselves either to fix the prices of those products, so to fix the prices of some agricultural commodity that is purchased by American consumers, or if they're rigging bids that they submit, for the sale of products to supplier or to their customers. Price fixing and bid rigging are considered the very worst antitrust violations that you can commit. And unlike many other countries, they're actually pursued as crimes and prosecuted as crimes in the United States. So somebody, that engages in price fixing, can be sent to jail for it. And in recent years, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division has brought two very significant criminal prosecutions involving food products that are used by most American households. The first, while not strictly an agricultural product, involved canned tuna. So the big three household brands that, these people my age ate growing up as kids, Bumblebee, Starkist, and Chicken of the Sea, were fixing the prices that they charged to consumers for a number of years. And the DOJ got evidence of that, opened a criminal investigation, and there ended up being corporate guilty pleas, total fines, criminal fines were in excess, well in excess of $100 million. And several individuals were prosecuted, including the CEO of one of the companies who's now serving a 40-month jail sentence. So, very, very serious criminal investigation, serious for the companies, serious for the individuals who participated in it. And of course, serious for consumers who for many years paid more than they should have to go out and buy, a staple product used in American households. More recently, as kind of Claire, I think, already touched on, several chicken producers and their executives have been charged with price fixing and bid rigging of broiler chickens. So think about the chicken that you go out and purchase at Kentucky Fried Chicken or Church's Fried Chicken, Popeyes, wherever you go. The chickens that the company, that are produced to for those types of consumers has been the subject of criminal price fixing claims by the U.S. Department of Justice. One company has already agreed to plead guilty to that, and they paid a fine somewhere around $105, $110 million, a criminal fine in that range. And the USDOJ is actually, as we record this in early December 2021, is maybe today wrapping up a criminal trial against 10 executives in Denver who were charged with participating in that conduct. And then there's another trial that will be coming against some additional executives. And then there's at least one additional company or two additional companies that have been charged as well that will be the subject of future trials. So the case that's wrapping up right now, it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. The case will go to the jury. The jury will decide whether these executives are guilty or not guilty. The trial is kind of notable as criminal antitrust trials go because they haven't really put on any witnesses who have walked into court and taken the stand and said there was actually a criminal price fixing conspiracy that we participated in. Nobody has pled guilty. No individuals have pled guilty, which you normally see in criminal trials. Somebody's pled guilty and testifies. Instead, this trial is based largely on emails that show some communications between the companies and phone records that, essentially take the timing of calls, which you don't necessarily know the what was discussed on the call, and then compare them to other email communications and then maybe pricing announcements and things like that. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the jury does with that case. And then obviously there'll be some more trials to come in this area.
Certainly a space with a lot of moving pieces and a lot to watch in the coming months. To Brent, Claire, and Craig, thank you for joining us today. And to all our listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.